I went to my son's baby shower hoping to celebrate a new life, but he pulled me aside before I could even step inside and whispered, "Mom, please don't embarrass me in front of everyone." My name is Gloria. I am a 65-year-old single mother who spent 25 years working double shifts to give that boy a life I never had. I refused to cry or beg for an invitation. I just stood there in the cold parking lot as the muffled sound of smooth jazz and clinking glasses echoed from the party inside. It was the sound of a completely different world firmly shutting its doors on me. My calloused hands trembled slightly as I clutched a small velvet box tightly against my chest. My son and his pregnant wife had no idea what I was holding. They did not know the secret inside this box was a gift meant to secure their financial future forever. So instead of handing over their ultimate safety net to people who were ashamed of my existence, I turned my back on the bright lights and walked away into the night. Before I tell you exactly what I took back from them and the harsh legal reality they eventually had to face, please take a second to hit the subscribe button and join me for the full story. The rejection that night was not a sudden impulse, but rather a poison seeded a long time ago. Raising a child on a single income is a brutal reality. I worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on and put food on the table. My days started before dawn cleaning office buildings and ended past midnight taking orders at a local diner. The minimum wage barely covered rent, so I relied heavily on tips from sympathetic customers. My hands grew calloused and my back ached constantly, but I never complained. Every single dollar I earned went straight into a battered shoebox under my bed. I wore the same threadbare winter coat for 10 years, so my son Stephen could have new sneakers for school. The first real crack in our relationship appeared when Stephen was 12 years old. His middle school was hosting an annual spring festival. I managed to trade shifts and rushed straight from the diner to the school gym. I arrived wearing my polyester waitress uniform, smelling heavily of cheap frying oil and bleached countertops. I spotted Stephen laughing with a group of well-dressed classmates. They were wearing crisp polo shirts and branded shoes. When I called out his name and waved, his face instantly flushed a deep crimson. He looked around frantically as if searching for an escape route before reluctantly walking over to me. He barely spoke a word the entire evening. Later that night, during the quiet car ride back to our cramped apartment, he stared out the window and muttered his first truly cruel words to me. "Mom, you do not have to come next time." It felt like a physical blow to my chest, but I swallowed my pride. I convinced myself it was just a fleeting teenage phase. I kept working and saving relentlessly for another 15 years until I finally scraped together enough money to buy a spacious 4-bedroom house in a quiet Dallas suburb. It was my proudest achievement and my ultimate safety net. It was a place where I finally felt secure after decades of financial panic. However, I did not live in that beautiful house for long. 3 years ago, Stephen married my daughter-in-law, Carmen. They were a young couple drowning in student loans and wedding debt. So I made the biggest sacrifice of my life. I packed my belongings and moved into a tiny 1-bedroom apartment across town. I handed them the keys to my 4-bedroom home and told them to live there completely rent-free. I wanted to give Stephen the perfect launching pad so he could focus entirely on building his new career in the high-stakes finance industry without worrying about a mortgage. Carmen seemed endlessly grateful at first. She hugged me tightly and promised they would always take care of me. But as Stephen quickly climbed the corporate ladder and his paychecks grew larger, their gratitude slowly morphed into a toxic sense of entitlement. Everything started slipping out of control when Carmen got pregnant, and her family officially intervened in their lives. The moment the pregnancy was announced, my daughter-in-law's mother, Betty, immediately took charge of everything. Betty was a wealthy woman who wore designer clothes and carried herself with an air of absolute superiority. She was never the type of person who yelled or threw dramatic tantrums. Instead, she specialized in delivering sharp insults wrapped in polite smiles and soft tones. Whenever I tried to offer help or participate in the baby shower planning, Betty would swiftly shut me down. We sat in Stephen's living room one Sunday afternoon discussing the upcoming celebration. I excitedly offered to bake my signature apple pie and help prepare the party favors. Betty placed her delicate teacup carefully on the glass table and gave me a highly condescending smile. "Gloria, you do not need to worry about the menu at all," she said gently while adjusting her expensive pearl necklace. "The catering at this upscale country club outside Dallas is a bit different from your usual taste. We are serving miniature beef Wellingtons and imported artisanal cheeses. Your homemade pie is very sweet, but it just would not fit the elegant aesthetic we are going for." Stephen sat right next to her, completely silent. He stared blindly at his smartphone and pretended he did not hear his mother-in-law actively humiliating me in the very house I bought for him. They officially booked the lavish country club for the party and deliberately excluded my name from the host list. During those incredibly lonely weeks, my niece Valerie was my absolute only source of genuine comfort. Valerie is my late brother's daughter and a hard-working young woman who always remembered my worth. While my own flesh and blood went an entire month without calling me to check in, Valerie visited my cramped apartment every single Tuesday evening. She brought containers of warm homemade soup and sat on my faded couch, listening to me talk excitedly about the new baby. She noticed the deep sadness in my eyes and held my hands tightly, reminding me that I was a wonderful mother. The stark contrast between my devoted niece and my completely indifferent son truly broke my heart. Despite the overwhelming sense of rejection, I refused to let Betty win or let bitterness ruin my joy. I convinced myself that my future grandchild deserved a perfectly secure life, regardless of the toxic adults surrounding the poor child. So I made a monumental decision. I drove downtown to visit my longtime family lawyer, Richard. I sat in his quiet office and instructed him to draft an official property deed transfer. I was going to legally sign over the entire 4-bedroom suburban house to Stephen and Carmen. It was a massive financial asset worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. I secured the meticulously prepared legal document, hoping it would prove my unconditional love once and for all. The night of the party, I drove my 15-year-old sedan into the brightly lit parking lot of the country club. The pristine valet roundabout was completely jammed with gleaming luxury vehicles and imported sports cars. My worn-out engine sputtered embarrassingly loud as I bypassed the valet stand and pulled into a dark spot near the very back of the lot. I turned off the ignition and took a deep breath. I stepped out of the car and carefully smoothed down the navy blue dress I had purchased on clearance at a local discount store. I spent hours getting ready, hoping to look presentable, but standing under the towering stone arches of the exclusive club, I suddenly felt painfully out of place. Before I could even take 10 steps toward the grand entrance, a tall figure emerged from the shadows of the manicured hedges. It was Stephen. He was wearing a meticulously tailored charcoal suit that undoubtedly cost more than the current value of my vehicle. He did not greet me with a warm smile or open his arms for a hug. Instead, his eyes immediately darted toward my rusty sedan. He visibly cringed as he noticed a small puddle of dark engine oil dripping onto the immaculate cobblestone pavement. Then his frantic gaze swept over my modest discount dress and my sensible flat shoes. A wave of pure, absolute panic washed over his face. He stepped directly into my path, intentionally using his body to block my progression toward the glowing glass doors. "What are you doing here?" he hissed through clenched teeth. I looked past his tense shoulders and peered through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the main banquet hall. The room was absolutely breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over dozens of elegantly dressed guests. I could clearly see a group of older, distinguished men laughing near the open bar. "Stephen, I came to celebrate the baby and give you my gift," I said softly while clutching my purse. He aggressively rubbed his temples and kept nervously glancing back at the glass windows, ensuring nobody was watching us. Mom, those men standing inside are the senior executive partners at my wealth management firm. Betty invited her entire elite social circle and the country club board of directors. Everyone who actually matters in Dallas society is standing in that room right now. We can do a private lunch next week, just the two of us. But tonight is about networking and securing our future. He took a deliberate step closer and lowered his voice to a sharp, cold whisper. He did not raise his hand or shout, but his words cut far deeper than any physical violence ever could. Look at yourself, Mom. Look at your leaking car. Look at your clothes. You do not belong in a place like this. Carmen is already stressed enough trying to impress these people, and we cannot afford any mistakes tonight. Please do not embarrass me in front of them. I stood completely frozen under the harsh parking lot security lights. The crisp night air suddenly felt impossibly heavy and suffocating. I stared directly into the eyes of the man standing before me and realized he was a complete stranger. The deeply embarrassed 12-year-old boy had permanently evolved into a man utterly consumed by shallow vanity and ruthless social climbing. He honestly believed a cheap private lunch would compensate for publicly discarding his mother. He was entirely willing to erase his own flesh and blood just to maintain a flawless, wealthy facade. All my decades of backbreaking labor and silent sacrifices had only purchased his arrogance. I did not argue or scream or shed a single tear. I simply nodded once, acknowledging the death of our relationship. I turned around and walked back to my car in absolute silence. Sitting in the cold car on the highway heading home, I removed the velvet wrapping and stared at the unsigned property transfer deed. The streetlights flashed rhythmically across the thick parchment paper, illuminating the blank signature line. This single document represented my entire life savings and my ultimate sacrifice. I pulled my old vehicle over to the dark shoulder of the empty road. I did not scream or hit the steering wheel. The profound sadness that initially crushed my chest had completely evaporated, leaving behind a chilling clarity. I gripped the edges of the deed and tore it straight down the middle. The sound of ripping thick paper was surprisingly satisfying. I placed the pieces together and tore them again and again until the legal document was reduced to nothing but worthless confetti. I rolled down my window and let the cold Texas wind scatter the pieces into the dark night. My tears had stopped entirely. I put the car back in drive and went home to sleep peacefully for the first time in months. The very next morning, I walked straight into Richard's downtown law office. Richard had handled my modest legal affairs for many years, and he looked up in genuine surprise as I sat down across his heavy mahogany desk without a scheduled appointment. I did not waste time with small talk. I looked him directly in the eye and told him I needed to reclaim my suburban house immediately. I explained that I wanted my son and his wife removed from the property. Richard leaned back in his leather chair and carefully took out a legal notepad. He saw the cold determination in my eyes and did not try to talk me out of it or ask unnecessary emotional questions. He simply shifted into his professional role and outlined the exact legal steps we needed to take. Richard explained the strict procedures under Texas property law since there was no formal lease agreement in place. "Gloria, we cannot simply lock them out or throw their belongings onto the lawn," he stated calmly while writing down the dates. "I will draft a formal 30-day notice to vacate. We will send this document to the house via certified mail with a return receipt requested, so we have absolute proof of delivery. This legally forces them to vacate the premises within 30 days. I listened intently and nodded. Richard continued explaining the timeline. "If they refuse to leave after the 30 days expire, I will immediately file a formal eviction suit with the county court. Only then will Stephen receive an official summons from a judge." He printed the official notice right there in his office and placed it on the desk between us. He handed me his heavy silver pen. I looked at the stark legal language demanding my own son vacate my property. A few days ago, my hand would have trembled at the mere thought of causing him any distress. Now my hand remained perfectly steady. I signed my name at the bottom of the page with bold, definitive strokes. The fragile, overly accommodating mother who wore discount dresses and begged for scraps of affection had vanished forever. I stood up and thanked Richard before walking out of the building into the bright morning sunlight. I finally took my power back. That weekend, just as the certified mail delivery receipt updated in the postal system, my phone began ringing with Stephen's name flashing on the screen. I let it ring 3 times before finally pressing the green button. I did not even get a chance to say hello before his voice exploded through the speaker. He was breathless, and his tone was a chaotic mixture of pure panic and explosive anger. He demanded to know what the terrifying legal document meant and why a downtown law firm was suddenly threatening to throw his family out onto the street with only 30 days to prepare. I calmly corrected his assumption and reminded him that his name was never actually on the property deed. He quickly shifted his manipulative tactics and tried to use heavy emotional guilt as his primary weapon. He immediately weaponized Carmen and the unborn baby, claiming the stress of packing and moving would severely endanger the pregnancy. He loudly reminded me that the baby nursery was already painted and fully decorated with expensive imported furniture. He desperately painted himself as the innocent victim of an irrational and vindictive mother. I sat perfectly still at my small kitchen table listening to his empty accusations. He completely ignored his own cruel behavior and focused entirely on the massive financial inconvenience he was currently facing. His voice cracked as he yelled his final dramatic defense. "After everything I have achieved, you stab my family in the back like this?" The sheer audacity of his completely oblivious statement echoed loudly in my quiet apartment. He truly believed his corporate promotions and wealthy social circles were built entirely on his own independent hard work. I did not raise my voice or match his hysterical energy. I spoke softly, but with absolute, unshakable authority. "And who paid for the foundation of those achievements?" I asked coldly. The phone line went silent for a brief moment. I did not let him gather his thoughts or interrupt me. "You traded your own mother for a country club membership card. Now you can pay rent for your own pride." He started to stammer nervously and attempted to backtrack his previous insults, but I was already done listening to his empty excuses. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button, disconnecting the call immediately. I then opened my contact settings and permanently blocked his personal number. There would be absolutely no further negotiations and no dramatic emotional apologies. He was a grown man who made a calculated choice to discard me for superficial social status. Now he would have to face the brutal reality of the open real estate market without his mother providing a hidden financial shield. The silence in my apartment was deeply comforting. I simply stood up from the wooden table and poured myself a fresh cup of hot tea, feeling lighter than I had in 3 decades. 30 days passed, and an official court summons was finally served when they stubbornly refused to leave, forcing Stephen to face absolute reality. He quickly realized my legal threats were not a bluff. They frantically hired a moving company and were forced to relocate into an incredibly expensive and cramped apartment downtown. The lavish nursery furniture they bought with their credit cards barely fit into their new tiny second bedroom. Carmen complained bitterly every single day about the lack of space and the sudden, overwhelming financial burden of paying their own steep monthly rent. The universal karma they experienced was not dramatic or explosive. The wealthy country club friends and elite corporate partners did not suddenly point fingers or laugh at their financial downfall. The social rejection was much quieter and far more painful. Their phones simply stopped ringing. The exclusive weekend golf invitations gradually faded away. The extravagant dinner parties hosted by Betty's elite circle continued to happen, but Stephen and Carmen were quietly crossed off the guest lists. Even Betty herself became incredibly distant once she realized her son-in-law no longer owned a valuable suburban property and had no real generational wealth to offer. Sitting in that overpriced apartment, Stephen finally realized a devastating truth. His prestigious social relationships were entirely superficial. They were based on a fake wealthy status he had temporarily borrowed from his hardworking mother. Once the property was completely empty, I immediately put the 4-bedroom suburban house on the real estate market. The house sold above the initial asking price within just 2 weeks. I deposited the massive check and felt a profound sense of financial liberation. I did not keep all the money for myself. I took a significant portion of those funds and invested it directly into Valerie's new independent bakery business. She had shown me genuine warmth and brought me hot soup when my own son abandoned me. She deserved a solid foundation for her future because true family should be defined by mutual care rather than blood. I am currently standing in the airport terminal watching airplanes taxi across the tarmac. I packed a single large suitcase and booked a month-long cruise across the Mediterranean. I am finally spending my hard-earned money on my own happiness. I learned a brutal but incredibly necessary lesson during this entire painful ordeal. You can never sacrifice enough to earn basic respect from people who have already decided you are worthless. You should never continuously erode your own soul trying to build a pedestal for those who treat you like a disposable stepping stone. I am choosing myself now, and the view from here is absolutely beautiful.